give you more knuckle.
Hello guys and welcome to Live War and Anime. Today let's talk about Nick Diaz, the real life Ryo Narushima. For those of you who don't know who Ryo Narushima is, he's the main protagonist of the fighting manga Shamo. And just to tell you a little bit about him, right from the start Ryo has all the chips stacked against him. He's portrayed from the beginning as a guy who doesn't deserve compassion. Yet beyond the initial presentation, although we see that Ryo is somewhat terrible as a person, we also see that he holds humanity in him. He's the main villain and main character of the story. The other possible villain maybe being society itself. You know, whether in real life or in stories, I like fighters who have a chip on their shoulder, a grudge, something to prove, a dislike for looking squeaky clean. By that, I mean fighters who play the heel, the villain, and who are portrayed as villains, even against their own will. And I have never seen someone as close to Ryo Narushima in modern fighting as Nick Diaz, the original gangster of MMA. First, let's go back to March 16, 2013, at the Bell Center in Quebec, Canada. Nick Diaz would fight GSP for the World Championship. The two men couldn't be further apart in personality or in how they were perceived by the audience. GSP, the handsome, well-spoken champion, seen as the perfect hero of Canada, well-mannered, respected, loved by the fan base. Nick Diaz, on the other hand, the Stockton bad boy, not good at speaking but more laconic, more ferocious in his remarks, not a person who would waste his breath responding to an opponent's insults or an interviewer's silly questions with a lengthy and well-articulated answer, when often an "FU" would suffice, and express his point perfectly anyway. Nick was rough-looking. He was judged both by his background, his way of talking, and his looks, and branded a villain. You can't have two good guys in fighting, not if you want to sell tickets. But there was something about Nick Diaz that for a lot of people made him an intriguing character. He had the look of someone who had been left starving, left wanting attention maybe, wanting a better luck, wanting to be recognized at the same level as his peers. Nick Diaz was born in Stockton, California in 1983, raised by his mother along with his brother Nate. Nick was forced to be tough. Since he was a kid, he looked already ready to fight, even in the most routine and daily moments where kids would be smiling and look relaxed. Nick looked to show that he was ready for anything. This is not how you would normally grow in the suburbs, in a nice two-parent household where money is never an issue.
Immediately they consider me dangerous. They're like, you've hit this guy and you drew blood from him and you've cut him and you are dangerous and we can't have you on campus. And I'm like, I was attacked. And that's all I can think about. Like, I didn't even start this, you know?
From the start of his career, Nick was labeled as just a grappler and one with a very limited striking skill. But Nick had been investing in his boxing in secret. There were a few things that Nick had in his favor as a fighter: a good chin, strong heart not to give up, good stamina, and good fundamental boxing. Nick wasn't good at kicking or wrestling, he wasn't explosive, he didn't have one quick twitch fiver in his body. But when you combine his stamina, his chin, and his volume boxing, you got a unique mix of weapons. When Nick started to shine, what you had in front of you was a relentless machine that no matter how much you hurt it, it wouldn't stop coming. And there is nothing more fearsome than something that is relentless. Nick had a good chin, he could take a punch, but more than just chin, he had the will to fight back, the conviction not to be perceived as weak, not to give up, to dish it out, as much as he took it, and this cannot be taught in a gym. There are a lot of guys with a good chin who can physically continue in a fight, but would prefer to take a knee to surrender. They don't want the pain, and that's understandable. A good chin won't make you stand back up when you have been knocked down. What will make you stand up is a conviction, a belief, a hurt pride, a feeling of rage to get them back, to even the score, to show them they were wrong about you. Nick Diaz was an odd character for MMA. A pot-smoking vegan, a triathlete, a Mexican gangster. He was a unique personality, to say the least. Inside the octagon, you could beat Nick Diaz, but you couldn't knock him out. You couldn't stop him. The only reason you were coming out alive of that octagon was because after 25 minutes, the fight would be stopped. A referee would raise your hand, and a whole staff of security would allow you to leave the arena victorious, while Nick Diaz stared at you angrily from across the octagon, still wanting to continue. The ticking of the clock, his greatest obstacle to victory. It is often said as a joke that if MMA didn't have a time limit, the Diaz brothers would be champions. And as outlandish as that may sound, I'd have to say that it is very accurate. If the octagon closed until one of you was unconscious, most of the time Nick Diaz would come out on top. Maybe it would take him a few hours, maybe a few days, but at the end, he would be the one standing over your toothless, bloody corpse. And that is one scary thought. Nick Diaz was not invincible as much as he thought of himself as undefeated. But that added to his mystique, his stubbornness inside and outside of the octagon, made him who he was. It made him truly himself, with the good and the bad. He was often resentful of judges' decisions, of his portrayal in the media, of his coaches, his managers, his teammates, his rivals, life, the athletic commission, the law, the UFC, Dana White, himself. Maybe it was losing his girlfriend to a tragic accident in high school. Maybe the fights he was forced into as well in his youth, just to make it another day in school. Maybe the abandonment of his father. Maybe the lack of economic well-being, the hunger, his mother being too busy with work, his use of marijuana, and some sort of drug-induced paranoia. Maybe. But whatever it was, Nick Diaz believed people were out to get him. And sometimes he was right. The UFC was underpaying him, although he was a huge draw. He had issues with his own manager and coach, Cesar Gracie, calling him a crooked BJJ coach once in a public interview. He had issues with his boxing coach, Richard Perez, because he was not paying him on time or at all for one of his fights. You gotta remember, this is Richard Perez, a boxing coach who had been with Nick from the start and was very important in Nick's transformation as a high output boxer. Other times after his losses, he complained that people who promised to help him fight GSP and prepare him did not show up and did not keep their word. He said this again publicly. All people around Nick Diaz knew Nick was his own person, and often that person was one who would first blame other people for his failures and decisions. Richard Perez would comment on the controversy, saying dealing with Nick in business was hard, yet dealing with Nate was easy. They were different in this aspect as day and night. And after watching countless hours of interviews with Nick and Nate and having read endless amounts of articles for this video, I have to say this depiction seems just right. But when the Athletic Commission fined $165,000 and suspended Nick for 5 years because of multiple failed drug tests related to marijuana, But when Anderson Silva only got 6 months for using steroids, you cannot help but feel Nick Diaz was somewhat correct in feeling how he felt. He was robbed of his prime years as a fighter over the hurt ego of some corrupt bureaucrats. The main reason the Athletic Commission chose to make an example out of him being that they found his refusal to cooperate disrespectful. For good or bad, Nick Diaz was 100% himself all of the time. When most fighters focused on strength and conditioning through hitting tires or doing repetitions of high-intensity intervals, Nick chose to do things his own way. He would participate in triathlons, banking on the fact that in a fight, when it's time to give up, the man being the most tired would give up first. So he would make sure he was never tired inside the octagon. And since he couldn't really rely on being explosive, he would rely on being smart and being consistent. He would not give you a second to rest, smothering you with punches for 25 minutes. He would invest in boxing, and it would pay off for him, beating fighters whom at first he wouldn't have any business even fighting, like Robbie Lawler, Paul Daly, and Cyborg Santos, the latter who had fought at light heavyweight even. And Nick didn't outgrapple them. He chose to stand with them, and all of these guys were perceived as strikers, and Nick chose to beat them at their own game. I can assure you, if GSP would have fought these guys, he would have clinically out-wrestled them. This is not to bash on GSP, but just to contrast the difference in approach between the two. Nick didn't have the size or wrestling acumen to out-wrestle anybody in MMA, but he could out-punch God himself, given he had enough time. The first time he fought GSP, the day before he missed a few important interviews, and that caused the fight to be cancelled. This first cancellation would inflict a lot of damage to Nick Diaz, both economically and also to his image. But who was there to blame? His alarm? Did he doze off while smoking or partying? Was he simply nervous of the spotlight? We will never know. What we know is Nick would never take responsibility for this either. Later on, he would get a second fight with GSP, and this time he would show up to the pre-fight interview. There, GSP, being the good kid that he was, made a comment about Nick Diaz and how he reminded him of his bullies. And here is where Nick interrupted him and said to GSP, "How many times have you had a gun to your head, George? How many times has someone put a gun to your head? How many of your best friends have been shot through the chest with a 45? Or how many of your best friends have been stomped or put to sleep into a coma? I don't know about you, but when I compare Nick's childhood to being bullied in a Canadian school, GSP's plight doesn't sound like the tragic backstory it was made out to be." Later on, Nick would also mention something that bothered him. He said, "In the street, some soccer mom yelled to him, 'I hope GSP knocks you out.'" This observation made Nick Diaz visibly disappointed. Not only he had to fight GSP, the consensus best fighter in the world, but he had to be hated while doing so. And it's in these moments where we see one facet of Nick Diaz that wasn't what was in the script. Is when we see that for the media, the bad guy cannot have reasons to be quiet or antisocial or being more aggressive. The only reason the bad guy is because he's a bad person, period. The world is a simple place, and that's how it should stay. But Nick Diaz broke the mold for the bad guy narrative. He was confrontational, he was afraid, he was insecure, he was brave, he was sometimes right, and above all, he had reasons to be so. He had a past. He wasn't who he was out of nowhere. And he was making us relate to his story, to being the underdog, the ugly guy, the poor guy, the bad guy. Nick would end up losing to GSP, but he wasn't submitted or knocked out. And at the end of the fight, he would raise GSP's hand, and when GSP tried to return the gesture by raising Nick Diaz's hand, like the nice guy GSP is, Nick responded in the most Nick Diaz way and yanked his hand from GSP, and Ming mugged him, ready to scrap with him again. Nick Diaz's career was marked by UFC abusing him financially, by the media mislabeling him as a bad guy, and sometimes labeling him correctly as a delusional fighter who has never admitted to a loss. But the people who really watch the sport love Nick Diaz. There is hardly a better known fighter than him, his current career being nothing more than seeking some payday that would ease him from his financial troubles. Nick Diaz doesn't want to fight anymore, and with good reason. At this age, he should be enjoying the fruits of his labor in retirement, but that UFC's years of underpaying him has caused him to keep coming back to fighting, to very sad results. But for me, Nick Diaz was the ultimate Rocky story. Maybe to the media, that evil Rocky, but Rocky nonetheless.